Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. As you can see here, where I live in Los Angeles, it's still nighttime. Kidding, I have no idea what city this is. Anyway, just thought it'd be a nice change to have a different background. Hope you're doing well, and the test went okay for you. It certainly seemed to have gone okay for most of you, at least. You all did very well, as people have been doing on these take-home format exams. The average was 49 out of 60, with a high of 58 and a low of 30, I think. But most of you did very, very well. I did put a very rough letter grade translation on the iLearn site. If you take a look at that, you'll see that I made sure to indicate that it was rough. So it's basically, giving you what number range will be translated to what letter grade. However, I haven't listed pluses or minuses there. I haven't, gotten very specific. And that's intentional. It really depends on how people do on the last exam. But what I wanted to do is give you a general idea of how you'd be doing, how you're doing in the course. And so, we don't assign letter grades until both scores are taken and then add it up. And then, we see how the rest of the class does. And then we add pluses and minuses, of course. But that should give you some general idea. So if you are concerned about how you did, this is a good time to talk to Dylan. And if he can't help you, I'm happy to help you as well. Dylan is the one that will go over your test with you, though, if you'd like to, if you have questions. Of course, you can now look at your performance on the test, see which ones you got wrong. If you don't understand why you got it wrong, it's a good idea to bring it to Dylan. And again, if you can't answer, I can certainly help you with that as well. Okay. The format of the last exam will be exactly the same. I'm reluctant to call it a final because it's just based on the second half of the course. And it will be roughly the same number of questions, 60 questions, plus or minus a few. You will also be given a range of days. I don't know if I can give you as many days to take the exam in. It depends on when I have to have grades, and it will at least be 2 days, though. And I certainly will know that as we approach the end. So that would be next week, the end of next week, right? We have 2 more weeks left. So, okay. Yes. Dylan, I will give you a key. Sorry. Although that should be available on the test. Okay, I'll.
No, yeah, the correct answers are available, but your midterm key tricked me for the second time. They're never going to give you up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you got Rick
You
rolled
gave a
again.
good laugh, though.
You got Rick rolled twice. Is that right, Dylan? Okay. Representing UCR PhD students as well. Well, congratulations. You can never get enough Rick Astley, if you ask me. All right. Okay. Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay. So let me take a couple of seconds here, see if there's questions. Looks like there's something, or is that just yeah. That's so funny. Okay. Questions on the midterm, questions, how the final is going to work, or how we score, how we do final grades, anything like that. Okay. No, you all happy with your grades? Good. Well, most of you did really, really well. Taking it home, open book, knowing a lot of the questions beforehand. We know that it's easy. Hopefully you're learning the material, you're enjoying the material, and it's not too stressful for you. That's important for us now. We know everyone's under a very stressful situation. Even though things are better, it's still stressful. And we'd like you to learn the material. So, okay, then let's continue with the material. Excuse me. And just to remind you where we were here, we were talking about touch. All right, make sure my sound, video clip. Go, there we are. Okay, so, sorry everybody. Okay. So all this touch stuff is material that's going to be on the last exam. It obviously wasn't covered on the midterm. So we were talking about touch in a number of different contexts, but one of the things we're going to be using our discussion of touch to cover is this idea of change in the brain and change in behavior. Especially when, as we first started talking about it, it was change when cross-modal compensation was needed. So in the case of the amazing John Bramblett, and that's the blind painter who learned to paint with touch after he went blind, and how the fact that it is very likely that his visual brain is helping him with his touch sensitivity. And that's a really nice demonstration of cross-modal plasticity. But then we started getting into the fact that cross-modal plasticity or cross-sensory plasticity, it's the same thing, seems to occur not just for people who are born blind or acquire blindness later in life, like John, even though that's what we just used to think. It also seems to work for sighted individuals who are deprived of sight for a very short amount of time. So we talked about this, kind of grueling experiment where people are checked into a hospital room and are blindfolded for 5 days, and their visual brains start getting reassigned to touch. And we learned something important in that context. And don't forget one of those lessons that we learned, that seems to occur even without intense touch experience. Remember, there were a number of different groups that were tested in that study. One was where, in fact, people were blindfolded for 5 days, and they went through something like Braille training, and they showed increased skill at Braille, but they showed involvement in of their visual brain areas with that improved touch skill. But we also found this other group that didn't have that intensive Braille training. They were just blindfolded for 5 days. And they also showed an improvement and also showed that their visual brain was involved in touch. So it does seem to be not just, there's no question that experience can help with this, but it's the deprivation that really seems to kick the visual brain into helping with other sorts of senses. And we find that this deprivation with sighted people doesn't even need to be for 5 days. It can be for as little as 3 hours, as we were talking about at the end of last class. That enhances touch discrimination for those little plastic grids you're seeing there, and it does involve visual brain regions. And then we talked about this final example that there are even instances where when you're not blindfolded for any period of time, but you need to use your sense of touch without being able to use vision at the time, like when it's dark, when you have your hands in your pocket to feel for the right key you want to choose to put into a lock, it is likely you're using your visual brain at that point. So there's other examples of that as well. But the kind of big take-home point here is this, that unlike how we used to think, that this cross-modal compensation that occurs in the brain and in behavior isn't just reserved for people who are blind. It occurs for all of us, and it occurs for instances when we are deprived of vision for very short periods of time, or even in situations where we just need to use our sense of touch for kind of highly, complex or highly involved sorts of spatial judgments, like choosing which key is right. And so that last couple of statements there, cross-sensory plasticity is a strategy for all brains, not just the brain of a blind individual, not just the sensory impaired. And that's going to be an important point as we kind of come back to this when we discuss cross-sensory integration and cross-sensory perception, cross-modal perception. It's going to be a really important point to see. However, we're going to go back right now and just talk about one other issue that's going to potentially be helpful for the blind, given the fact that touch can kind of compensate for blindness. So this is something I think you'll find very interesting, and something that's been been attempted for many decades now. And that is the idea of a touch device that can help the blind. Now, as I said, this is something that's been tested for many decades. You know, I remember, I think I might have mentioned, it's in the book, that my dad worked for he was the director of an agency for the blind in upstate New York. And I remember back in the 60s and 70s when I'd go to his office, he had these pictures of these individuals, these blind individuals, who'd be wearing this huge backpack. And the backpack basically had this really heavy kind of apparatus on that would be designed to touch the back of the person. So basically, you know, it was something that kind of lay against the back. And that device had little posts kind of on it, you know, like tiny little, you know, probably about the, you know, the size of, probably, I don't know, something like the head of a nail or something like that. And it was like an array of like 50 that would be touching the back. Imagine all these little nail heads touching the back of a person. And connected to that was this camera that was in front of the individual, the blind individual, that they could control, and they would look at things in front of them. And that camera information would be translated to vibrations on those little posts that were touching their back. And so if they were looking forward and they aimed the camera at like a triangle that was positioned on the wall, that information of the triangle would get kind of translated into mechanical energy. So there would be a triangle pattern vibrating on their back. And with some practice, they'd be able to say, oh, that's the triangle. They move the camera. That's the square over there. And that's the circle over there. And this would be something potentially that could be refined and be used to help the blind kind of, you know, determine what's in front of them at a distance based on the touch stimulation they're getting in their back. You know, this was, you know, kind of clunky and not very convenient. You know, it was a very heavy device, very expensive device too, but, you know, it was kind of a test device to see if it was something that could work. But then over the decades, as they you know, kind of continued this idea, they learned to refine it in some really useful ways, some ways that kind of made use of new technologies. And the state of the art, I actually should check into this. It's been about 5 years since I've looked at this, but the state of the art, meaning that the most modern instance of this is a device that's like what was on the back, but now has been kind of shrunk. And rather than there being vibrating electrodes or vibrating posts, there were kind of like little stimulation that can actually apply to the tongue. And that's what you're seeing right there. So this is something called the, this is something called the tongue display unit. I'm realizing this great video I wanted to show you is not going to play for some reason, but I'll see if I can find it for you. Anyway, let me describe it first, and I'll see if I can get the video very quickly. The way it works is what you're seeing here. So this array of like little electrodes has now been shrunk. So it's no longer on your back. It actually is placed right on the tongue, and they're not vibrating. Instead, they're just very, very weak electrical charges. I don't know if you've ever used your tongue to touch the top of a 9-volt battery. Okay, this is the sort of thing we used to do when we were kids to determine whether or not the battery was still good. There's much safer and more pleasant ways of doing that, but you can still do it. So if you touch the top of a 9-volt battery, put your tongue on both little, that's the square battery, the rectangular battery. You know, you can feel like a tiny little shock. It kind of feels like some sort of cross between that. And yeah, it's probably a little bit more pleasant than that. It kind of feels like bubbles on your tongue. I had a chance to try this out. It feels like little bubbles on your tongue that are, you know, that are kind of systematically presented to your tongue. So imagine bubbles is probably better than the 9-volt battery thing. The question is, can blind individuals learn to use this? So it's so much more convenient, right? I mean, it's not, you know, I mean, it makes it difficult to talk without pulling the thing out. but you know, it's a much smaller device. The reason it's on the tongue, by the way, is it allows for much less energy requirements in the device, because you know, the saliva of your tongue allows the stimulation, the electrical stimulation, to be much more efficient. So you don't need to, you know, carry something large. You don't need a lot of battery power. It's very mechanically and electronically efficient to do this on your tongue. Okay, and your tongue is also, by the way, your tongue's a pretty, when it comes to touch, your tongue's a pretty sensitive little part of your body, which is also a useful characteristic of this. So how good can people get? And here I'm going to try to find this video for you. Sorry, oops. If not, I'm just going to have to explain it. Hold on just a second. Yeah, I think I found it. That's not it. That's me playing guitar. That's somebody else playing guitar. That's embarrassing. Okay, let me open this up. Okay, you can't see that. Okay, that's fine. Let me just make sure it's going to work, and then I'll share the screen again. Yeah, it's going to work. Okay. I'm glad you couldn't see that. All right, go back here. Let me share the screen again, and hopefully this will work. Shoot. It says QuickTime. Okay. I'm hoping this is going to work. Let me share the screen. Crap. Why is that not sharing that? Hold on a second. Oh, I know that's my friend's band. Hold on. Tongue display unit. There it is. Sharing is paused. Bring your share window to the front. Okay, hold on a second. I'm going to stop sharing again. Why this is having such trouble? Where is this? Ah, there it is. Okay, this should work. Then it's... Sorry, everybody. Okay, hopefully you're going to see this. If not, start chatting or say something.
At first glance, Roger Bain looks like an independent guy who loves his power tools. And he is. But here's what he's actually seen since he was a young man.
That you can put around.
But part of his world is slowly coming back into focus through experimental technology called BrainPort. One day it could actually help blind people see, in a sense, using their tongues. Yes, their tongues. It swaps tiny cameras for eyes and transforms the images into electrical impulses that are felt on the tongue.
It's as if it's drawing on the tongue the still image. And so if you capture the images fast enough, paint them fast enough, it's like a video display. Instead of being on a screen, now it's on your tongue.
You know, when you're a kid, I don't know if you did or not, but when you were kids would draw on your back and you try to guess what it is.
In normal vision, the eyes send signals to the middle of the brain. From there, the signals are sent directly to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. Not so for the blind. The BrainPort retrains the way the brain processes information by first stimulating the tongue with an array of tiny electrodes. The nerves in the tongue send signals through a different pathway to the brainstem and the area that deals with touch. Eventually, the blind person learns to interpret touch as sight in the visual cortex. Sounds impossible? Well, watch how Roger walks through the BrainPort office without any guidance. He can navigate this obstacle course, picking out specific shapes.
Excellent.
The camera sees this image, Roger feels it on his tongue, and that's how he can even spot the logo on a football jersey.
Very good.
Other blind volunteers recognize numbers.
9.
It's like learning a language. At first, you might need to spend a lot of time thinking about what the translation is. I may feel stimulation in the right front part of my tongue. What does that mean? But very rapidly, like learning a language, you might learn a few quick vocabulary, and eventually you become so fluent that you don't need to think about it anymore.
Blindfolded, I try it myself. After a humbling first attempt,
I want to say it's diagonal.
Okay. And this one is vertical.
I managed to understand some of the Brainport language.
I want to say it goes this way.
You are correct.
Okay.
The technology is improving. Today, a car looks like this to a Brainport user. A few months from now, they hope it will look like this. And in a year and a half, more like this. For the blind, they're a glimpse at more freedom.
This develops where the next generation can really get benefits from it. Even if I don't get the greatest out of it, I'm still can determine if I can see their eyes and maybe even see a smile or a grin, you know, that kind of stuff. It can be cool.
And for the rest of us, it's a miraculous look at how our brains can be trained to rewire themselves. Daniel Seberg, CBS News, Madison, Wisconsin.
Cool. Let's see. Let's go back to our slide. Uh-oh. These are a little, okay, hold on just a second. Let me change something here. Okay, hopefully we're good here. All right, let's go back to our slide. Hold on. Yeah. So, cool. Yes, so this is the tongue display unit that we're talking about. And you got a sense of a little bit of what it's like, that it does take a while to get comfortable with this and to be able to use it in an effective enough way that you can, you know, be navigating with it. But right off the bat, people can do some things. So they showed that reporter actually, you know, not being perfect at it, but being able to do things with, you know, recognizing lines and their orientation. They also find that people can pretty much off the bat recognize curves and that sort of thing. Then with a little training, maybe they'll recognize shapes, things that move, such as rolling balls. And then, as you saw, that individual being able to do, being able to traverse mazes, or, you know, just move down hallways and find open doors and that sort of thing, and letters a little bit at a time. But it is difficult. There's no question. It takes a lot of training to get that far. The interesting thing is, though, and you know, I think this is kind of a useful sort of anecdote that happens. That at first, as they said, it is like learning a language that you have to kind of translate intellectually, consciously translate. Okay, I feel a tickle on the right side of my tongue, or I feel a tickle in the middle of my tongue. Maybe that means it's vertical line. I feel tickles going from the right side to the left side of my tongue. Maybe that's a horizontal or a slanted line. It is like that sort of conscious effort that it takes. But then after a while, as they mentioned there, it does become a little bit more, I guess, spontaneous and second nature. You know, they are able to do things like the shapes and the rolling balls and the mazes and things like that. And it's at that point where it becomes less a tongue sort of experience and more an experience of things outside in front of you. And that's what, you know, that individual that you saw just now, and other people who've gotten very good at this will say, is that all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but over time, you start to realize that you're not really experiencing, your consciousness is not really directed to your tongue as much as you're getting an experience that there are things in front of you. And it is thought that when that kind of conscious shift occurs, that is when the visual brain area is becoming involved, which is kind of cool. So we've been talking about how the visual area gets recruited for touch in these sort of examples of a blind individual and that sort of thing, and what goes on neurophysiologically as you become more practiced or something like that. But here we have kind of a conscious experience that kind of corresponds to it, which is kind of cool, I think, right? So they can kind of predict by the time the person starts experiencing things out in front of them rather than things on their tongue that need to be translated. That's when the visual brain area is really getting involved. So that's very cool. They experience things outside their body. And that is likely when, as far as we know, the visual brain is actually becoming involved. So it's kind of cool that all this kind of cross-modal plasticity, this cross-modal compensation that occurs, we know occurs in the brain by imaging. It also has this kind of conscious correspondence in the conscious experience of what people are experiencing in these situations. Now, as you saw there, the resolution is poor, and it still is. 5 years ago, I looked. It still is poor. It takes a lot of training. It's unclear whether, it's kind of at this point, they've been working on these sort of devices for so long. And by the way, it's not only this device. If you want to do a search on the internet, you'll find devices that translate visual information into sound, where, if something's very large in front of you, a camera, or sometimes it's lasers, will detect something large in front of you, and that will be translated into a kind of a louder sound. If it's a smaller thing in front of you, it will be translated into a quieter sound. If it's high up in the the visual plane, if it's something that's high in front of somebody, it will be a higher sound. If it's lower towards the ground, it will be a lower sound. It's that type of thing, translating visual information, into this case, into auditory information. But I think people find this sort of thing a little bit easier, but both are very, very hard and very, very effortful. So it's unclear whether those sort of training mechanisms are going to be useful to the point that they will be widely available and widely used by the blind before the actual treatments now that have been applied to some blind individuals that actually provide information either directly to their visual cortex with implants or directly to their retinas. And you might know a little bit about this. There's a number of different technologies that have been used that involve surgical intervention by re-stimulating the retina or directly stimulating the visual cortex. And they've had some success with these, depending on the blindness, depending on the experience of the blind person, that sort of thing. And these, if they can get these to work to the degree that even to the kind of minor degree that these things work, are probably going to be the most convenient things of all, because you don't need to wear something over your ears to listen to the world, or listen to those tones, rather than listening to things like reflected information, which is so important, or having to wear something on your tongue. If these implant things seem to work, and it could be they're going to be the things that are probably treatments, quote, treatments for the blind sooner than these things are. That being said, I think these things are interesting kind of for conceptual reasons. They really do a nice job of demonstrating this kind of cross-sensory plasticity thing we're talking about. So even if these devices, and I think the tongue display unit you can buy. I don't think many blind individuals have bought them, but I think you can buy these things, even if they never really become useful enough for them to be accepted widely. And it is the kind of the surgical sort of implants that end up being most used. it does really kind of do a nice job demonstrating this kind of cross-sensory, cross-modal plasticity idea. Okay, are there any questions on this? Any questions about how these work or their effectiveness or anything like that? All right, it's interesting stuff either way. Okay, what we're going to start doing now is we are going to move from cross-sensory plasticity a little bit and start talking about touch and plasticity in general. Okay, so as I said, we're going to use touch as our sense that's going to teach us about how the brain changes with experience. And you've already seen a little bit about with regard to cross-sensory sort of compensation. Now we're just going to talk about experiments that show how our touch sense improves with experience and how that affects the brain. And we're going to get a tiny bit technical, but hopefully it won't be. This is about as technical as the class gets, but hopefully it won't be anything too intimidating. But you know, if you need to take a breath, a sip of water or something like this, you know, this will be the time. Okay, so the general idea here is that the more you touch, the more your brain changes. And so what we're going to do is, I said, look at plasticity in the touch brain areas. And it's not important, you know, the details of the area. You know, I don't always remember, you know, the kind of nitty-gritty details of these things either, but I just want to give you a general sense. We are talking about a part of your brain that is like a strip going down here. That's it. So we talk about the visual brain over here, the auditory brain kind of over here. And as you know, a lot of these things are flexible. But what we're talking about now is a little strip of brain area. Am I showing that? Okay, yeah. I got a good head for this because I don't have any hair. A little strip that goes right down here. And if you're interested in these sort of things, it's called the somatosensory strip or the touch brain strip or something like that. And it's not important, you know, the technical details. I just want to give you a sense of where it is. And I also want to give you a sense that there's a map on that part of the brain, okay? And you're seeing that map right there in that top image. You can see how, so what you're looking at that top image now is, you know, I talked about it's right here, the strip is right here, but now I'm turning this way and you're looking straight at my brain and this is the map you're seeing, okay? So like right kind of in the middle, you'll see that's where things like the leg and toes and feet, knee are represented. And then as we start going down this way, am I showing this? As we start going down this way, you can see that the shoulder and the arm and the elbow are represented, and the hand and the fingers, the neck, that sort of stuff. And the idea, the way, what I mean here by represented is that when you touch those different areas of the body, you'll see activity up here, okay? So it's kind of easy, more or less, to map this out. Now, one of the first things you'll notice about that crazy map is that the area of the brain dedicated to that body part does not depend on the size of the body part, right? So look at how much is dedicated to the lips versus how much is dedicated to the leg, right? There's a lot more lips dedicated than there is legs area dedicated, although our legs are obviously bigger than our lips, okay? And that's the same of the hand and the tongue, as you can see, all those sorts of things. It turns out that the parts of our body that are, most sensitive to touch are the parts that are given the largest piece of brain there. Okay, so the map's relative sizes are dependent on the sensitivity of that body part, and therefore the function of that body part. So it's important for us to have a lot of sensitivity on our lips and our tongue and our mouth, and part of that, it has to do with our eating, and it's important for us to be able to feel what's going inside and all that sort of stuff. A lot of it has to do with communication. We want feedback from those areas in order to know that we're talking well and all that sort of stuff. Clearly, the hand is more sensitive, and it needs to be more sensitive than the thigh or something like that. And so it makes sense to give more area to the brain depending on the function and how that part of the body needs to have sensitivity. Okay, so that's kind of cool, because now what we can see, now what we can do is look at people who have different sorts of sensitivity and see if in fact the area that part of the brain has now dedicated is dependent on that. So can we change how much area is dedicated to different parts of the body with experience? Okay. So actually, we're going to use a blind example here. As we know, most blind people don't use Braille, but those that do, okay, have a larger area dedicated to the fingers that use for Braille. Okay, so when one reads Braille, they use the 3 middle fingers of both hands. And if you, kind of map out the touch area of a Braille user, you'll find that there's a much larger area dedicated to these 3 fingers than would be for somebody who doesn't know Braille. Okay, a sighted person or a blind person who doesn't know Braille. So because they use that all the time, the area kind of shifts. It's another kind of neat example of how the brain changes with experience. It's plasticity again. It's not just the Braille users, though. It's musicians. You could imagine, they have to have a very, very refined sense of touch when they're touching a stringed instrument or something like that. Do I have something I can use? Well, you know what a violin looks like. Here. Here's my violin. Okay. They hold like this. Okay. So I'm talking about a right-handed violinist now. And they bow with their right hand and they hold it with their left hand like this. Okay. And so what really needs to be done here for a violinist, they need to have a lot of fine touch sensitivity with the fingers of their left hand, right? Those are the ones that are going to be, playing the music, moving up and down like this, right? And what you find is that for the right-handed violinists, those fingers actually do have more area dedicated to them than the same fingers on the right hand. Now, yes, they do need sensitivity on the right hand to use the bow, but they're grabbing the bow like this, and it's certainly not as much of a sensitivity they need with their left hand fingers. So, unsurprisingly, if you look at the map of the left hand fingers versus the right hand fingers, there's substantially more area of that touch strip dedicated to the left hand fingers than the right hand fingers. Okay. But this sort of thing can happen even quicker. Okay. So you don't need a lifetime of violin to start showing these differences. You can bring people in the lab and have them train for a day or maybe a number of days on a skill using a tool, for example, and show that their brains will shift a little bit as well, almost to make room for the tool. Okay, so tongue use. And this is a project where people were asked, I think, for a few days to get very good at using tongs. Oh, I could have brought in tongs. Okay, you guys know what tongs look like. This is one of the advantages for teaching at home. I could go in my kitchen and get toast tongs or something like that, but I won't. You guys know what tongs look like, right? This is the sort of thing you get used for on your barbecue or whatever. Yeah, it's not bad for tongs. Okay, good. But what they do is they have people use that, probably metal tongs, and they have them move a little rubber cork around a board and put it in holes and stuff like that. And they have to, get it. They have to be very accurate at this. They have to be very efficient. They have to get quicker at it. And they are given an opportunity to practice for a number of days to get as quick as possible. They're given feedback and all that sort of thing. And they scan their brains before and after that intensive practice. And they find that, yeah, the brain kind of starts shifting around and does start giving more room to the fingers that are involved. But it's almost as if near the fingers, there's this extra space that is thought to kind of make use for the tongs almost. And we're going to talk a little bit about how tools kind of become part of our bodies later in some detail. But this is one of the first first examples of this. It's almost if the brain saying, okay, well, you're going to use those tongues like they're new appendages a little bit. So yeah, we're gonna dedicate a little space to those appendages, even if there aren't like little sensors at the end of, there's no little touch neurons on the tongues themselves, but a space is made for them, which is really interesting. Okay. What else? So certainly it's, this is kind of a very kind of systematic finding. The more touch experience you have, whether it's through Braille or violin, or even in the context of this, 1 hour experiment, or that's probably a few days experiment, the tongue thing, is very clear cut. And it also, unsurprisingly, shows that kind of increased amount of area dedicated now to that finger or whatever should increase your sensitivity to touch, and in fact it absolutely does. So this is research again done with musicians mostly, but you find that people like violinists who are using their left hand, or pianists who use both their fingers, both hands' fingers over time to be very, very sensitive to the feedback given by the keys and all that sort of stuff. They have, very, very strong, very good touch sensitivity. By the way, this is 2-point touch sensitivity. That's what I have there. And that's just, well, you see that little device, basically, this is, again, I can't remember if we've seen this, but this is a sort of touch measuring device that's used for, individuals who've had a stroke or older individuals to determine what their touch sensitivity is like. And basically, the question is, they're blindfolded, their eyes are closed. People are asked, can you feel one prong or two prongs touching your skin? And as you can see here, there would be one prong, but then and the person, if this were touching them, they'd say one prong. But now very slowly, we're going to move this to two prongs, and with more and more separation between them. See, as you go around this little spindle here, there's more separation. The question is, at what point can they feel that there's two prongs? And somebody with very high touch sensitivity, very good touch sensitivity, doesn't need much separation between the prongs at all to say, oh yeah, there's two. Someone who doesn't have very good touch sensitivity, maybe somebody in their 80s, might need this much space between the two prongs to say it. But what you find is pianists have a really, really impressive touch sensitivity, even if they are older. Remember I said before that the blind kind of have the touch sensitivity of somebody that's 25 years younger than them. And that's also very true of pianists, even if they are older. They will show this really impressive touch sensitivity in their fingers specifically, that is offsetting aging as well. So they have very good touch sensitivity. Cool. So this is not just something that happens cross-modally, right? As we've been talking about how the visual brain comes in to help touch. Here we're showing that the touch brain can make room for what's functionally important when it comes to touch sensitivity. And that can change over the course of years of practice, but it also can change over the course of days of practice. So this is a good time for us now to look at what's going on with the brain cells, okay? The cells, the neurons of the body, when it comes to this sort of plasticity, okay? This sort of brain change. Okay? This is our technical slide now. Don't worry, not too tough. You know what I'm going to do? Let's do a question first, and then we'll come in. Yes, let's do this. We'll come in fresh for this slide. It's time for a question anyway. All right, so let me stop the sharing and do a question, and we'll be all refreshed for our new difficult slide. Okay, this first question has to do with the blind's touch sensitivity. Oh my gosh, I just gave you the answer to this, but that's okay. You can get it in your notes anyway. I'll read it first, then we'll post it. A blind individual who is 75 years old will have the touch sensitivity of a sighted person who is about A, 80 years old, B, 50 years old, C, 25 years old, or D, 10 years old? Okay, too easy. Uh-oh, where is everybody? I'll give you another 20 seconds or so. All righty, I think that's enough. Most of you got it, not everyone, so let's just make sure we do review it. The correct answer is B. So it helps about 25 years. So somebody who's 75 will have the touch sensitivity of somebody who's 50. Okay, so it reverts about 25 years, not to a person who's 25 years old, but it reverts 25 years. So 75 minus 25 is 50. So that is the correct answer. It's not 25 years old or 10 years old, that those folks are going to be much more sensitive and are not going to, the blind don't have the advantage of that many years. The correct answer is B. Okay, they don't get worse either. It's not like they have the touch sensitivity of an 80-year-old, which none of you were fooled by anyway. The correct answer in this case is B. All right, great. You got it in your notes. All right, let's go back and share our screen again. Cool. So we're going to talk now about how plasticity occurs in the body, how it occurs in the neurons, the nerve cells. Okay, a little technical, but I'm trying to keep this intuitive as possible. In fact, I'll use an intuitive example that will help you, I think, understand this sort of thing. There we go. Okay, so let me, oops, shoot. So imagine you're learning something new, and it can be, maybe you decided since you've been home a lot that you've taken up a musical instrument or something like that you had never played before, or a sport or some sort of game or something like that involves some type of agility or something like that. I don't know, I'm trying to think of something. Oh, I know, my kids have gotten very good. We just got my son a what's it called, cornhole set, because he played cornhole this summer with some buddies, had a great time. So we got him one in the backyard, and it's fun for the family, right? And we're all playing it, and we're all getting better at it. Actually, at first we were, the bean bags were going everywhere. Cornhole is the one where you shoot the bean bags into the board that's kind of on the ground at an angle into the hole. It's like a tailgating game. Anyway, we're all getting better, and what's going on as we get better is our brains are changing, and the neurons associated with the muscles and tendons of our, I guess, right arm for all of us are changing as well. Okay, we're becoming better at that. Now, that would be an example of a motor system change. And also this is going to apply to sensory systems as well. So when we're talking about, say you've decided to play violin or guitar, we'll go with the guitar this summer. Your fingers are, at first your fingers were having trouble finding the strings and weren't pressing down that well on the strings. But little by little, your fingers are better at this now. And a lot of that has to do with what your fingers are feeling on the strings. You probably are aware of that. So you have a sense of how hard to press down on the strings depending on what your fingers are feeling. So your sense of touch with those fingers has gotten better. Okay. And at first, you might have improved over the course of a few days. But, that improvement, if you had stopped after a few days, you probably would have, say, okay, that was fun, but now I'm really busy. I've got to take this ridiculous Rosenblum class. So I'm not going to play guitar until it's over. When you go back, if you've only practiced for a few days, you're probably going to have to kind of start from scratch, right? And that would be, kind of a short-term change. We'll call that short-term plasticity. And what I'm going to tell you about now is what happens in the cells when you're first learning something, like over the course of a few days. All right. And the way I like to think of it is this. So I don't know if you've ever, lived in an old house. I know there's not as many old houses. I mean, where I grew up and when I guess graduate school would be a great example. I went to graduate school in Connecticut, and everyone lives in a pretty old house, apartment, grad school apartment. And, I lived there for 5 years and with some friends, and, we felt like we wanted to improve it. And, we had dinner parties and stuff like that. So we wanted to help that. And there was I remember in a lot of old apartments, there's lots of doors, or there's doors that aren't necessarily used as doors. So for example, there was a door between my dining room and the kitchen in this apartment I was living in with my buddies. And because, I guess the previous owners, or maybe many owners ago, wanted to use the walls, they actually put a couch in front of that door. They closed the door, put a couch there. Okay. It no longer was used for a door. So what we had to do is we had to go out into the hallway and go down to the kitchen. So to go between the kitchen and the hallway, we'd have to go down to between the kitchen and the dining room. We'd have to leave the dining room, go down to the kitchen, go into the kitchen, and vice versa to bring our food back. And we thought, it's kind of a pain. There's this door there, but there's a couch in front of it, and it's painted shut, right? The people that lived there before didn't want to use it as a door, so they basically painted over it. Kind of looked like a door still, but it was clearly painted over. It was, if we were going to use that as a door, it was going to have to be opened up somehow. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we moved the couch and we started kind of chiseling around the door a little bit. Where the paint was, where the paint had kind of sealed it shut, so we could use it as a door. Okay. And it helped. It really helped. When we had dinner parties, we'd be able to go through that passageway now. Okay. We'd be able to use that kind of connection between the rooms that wasn't being used. Okay. All right. That's what happens when you first learn a skill. You kind of establish what we can call dormant connections. Connections that have the potential to make the communication between cells more efficient, but kind of need to be reestablished, like chipping away the paint on the door and moving the couch so that we could go through the door and making the connection between the rooms more efficient. That's what your cells are doing when you're first learning a new skill. They're kind of reestablishing connections, or they're establishing connections between cells that haven't been connected, at least recently. Okay, that's what short-term plasticity does. Cool. So we start using that for a while. We'll go back to my apartment now. And they say, this is great. And we were having a lot of dinner parties. We had, we're in grad school, we're having parties and stuff like that. We said, this door is so good. Let's take the door off the hinges, right? And so now we don't even have to worry about whether it's opened or closed or anything like that. And it actually gave us more room so we could put our refrigerator back. We got to move our refrigerator. It really helped a lot. So we took the door off the hinges and we brought it, I think, downstairs to the basement and stored it there. And of course, our landlord didn't know about any of this. So, when you're that age, you don't worry too much about that. This did kind of establish a connection that made it more effective, right? Now, if we hadn't done that, it could be that after a while, we wouldn't be using that doorway anymore because you always have to open it and close it and things like that. In which case, you know, maybe we would just go back to just using the hallway and whatever. But we did decide to, you know, kind of increase the flow between the two rooms by taking the door off the hinges. Okay, so what we did is we kind of sustained our use between the rooms, through the doorway between the rooms. And now, okay, we're making that connection kind of something more solid by taking the door off the hinges, so it can be used very efficiently. And then, okay, if we continue doing that, we didn't do this, by the way, but let's pretend we did. Boy, this connection is so great between the rooms, right? We took the door off the hinges, we use it all the time. And, you know, we spend a lot of time in the kitchen and a lot of time in the dining room when we have friends over. Wouldn't it be great to be able to kind of socialize while we're across the rooms? And so imagine we did this. We didn't. We decide to kind of build another entryway, not entryway, I'm sorry, like a little, what's it called, half door, or I don't know what you'd call it, a bar. Basically what we did, what we could do is break through the wall next to the door on top and then build like a little, you know, kind of bar there. So we got this like door here. We've got like a big window here, okay, between the two rooms. You know, it's you know, basically a big open space between the two rooms. And so we can do a lot of things now between the two rooms. We can pass food between the two rooms. We can, you know, kind of talk to people in the dining room and socialize and have a good time. And what we've done is we've now established a new connection beyond the one that was the dormant connection. We improved the passage through the dormant connection by removing the door, okay, taking it off the hinges. Now it's a very clear passageway. And we've established a new connection between the rooms. And that's what's going on with the nerve cells. When you practice something, you know, when you're learning something, that short-term change where you're making these dormant connections now reused, or making, you know, we're taking advantage of those dormant connections, helps to give rise to what we call long-term plasticity, where we sustain the dormant connections by taking the door off the hinge, and new connections are formed, like breaking down the wall halfway down, so we can, you know, pass food and conversation even more efficiently. And now we have this connection between the two rooms that makes everything we do between the rooms more efficient. And that's what happens with cells when you go from short-term learning, short-term training, okay, to long-term training, right? And you have some intuitions about this, right? So, you know, when you first were learning to play guitar, when you were first learning to a sport when you were a kid, at first it's very effortful, and you know that, you know, so, you know, imagine batting a ball. I don't know if you remember that far back, but learning to bat a ball or something like that, or to catch a ball even. At first it's very effortful. And, you know, the first few times you start doing it, when you come back the next day, yeah, you kind of revert a little bit back to where you were before you started learning, right? So there's kind of this period where, you know, you kind of have to practice a little bit before you get to where you were the day before. But then after a while, you know, when you've established it, riding a bike, of course, is the other great example. When you've established it, you don't revert to your pre-learning period. And that's in fact when short-term plasticity becomes long-term plasticity. And that's when the neurons now have established these new connections, not just making use of dormant connections, but have established these new connections, okay? And this is in fact the plasticity that you see in the blind when you talk about cross-sensory plasticity, or just more generally expertise, okay? This is how expertise occurs. When you're first learning something, if you sustain that learning, that short-term plasticity that occurs by using dormant connections, kind of those dormant connections become kind of solidified. We've taken the door off the hinges. Now we've got this great connection between the passageway, and new connections nearby are going to be formed as well. That's long-term plasticity. That's a skill now you have potentially for most of your life. Okay, hopefully that's intuitive. I want to give you one other example of this. That's an experiment that's going to, I think, help you understand this. This helped me understand it really well. This is an experiment that actually has to do with motor learning, but as well as some sensory learning. But I think it really, really exemplifies what we're talking about. So I think it's useful. And it does involve this little keyboard down here. And what they did, I think you can still buy these at Guitar Center if you're interested. These are great. You know, if you are a garage band hobbyist, or you know, you make your own music or whatever, these are terrific. They connect to your computer, and you know, your computer probably has some software on it that allows you to you know, emulate any orchestra sound, any guitar sound, any drum sound you want. And the keyboard, basically, that little keyboard drives it. So these are great little keyboards. What they did is they gave every subject in this experiment a keyboard. And none of these subjects had any experience playing keys, okay, playing piano, playing any sort of keyboard, whatsoever. Okay, they just screened for that. I don't think they even had musical experience of any type. But what they did is they asked people to learn a kind of complicated pattern on the keyboard. So, you know, maybe it was a pattern that lasted about 30 seconds. You know, it was something like I can't remember what it was, if it was like a Bach passage or something. But it was something that, you know, nobody could play. And, you know, in the beginning at all, they had no keyboard experience, and it took them a while to learn. And it lasted about 30 seconds, and they had to learn to become better at this sort of thing. And what they did is it was one of these experiments where people had their brain scanned before they learned the passage and after they learned the passage, and then after a period of time practicing the passage and all that sort of thing. These subjects were paid, and I hope, because they were asked to do a lot of work. They were asked to practice the pattern for 2 hours a day for 5 days a week. Okay. You know, they were able to hear the pattern as well. It was, you know, it was a kind of, as I said, I think it was a Bach piece or something like that. So, you know, it wasn't totally unpleasant, but it was a tough pattern. And their job was to play it as efficiently and as accurately as possible without making any mistakes. Okay. And people came in at first and had their brains scanned before they started practicing. Okay. You know, they looked at to see, you might as well think about what they were scanning as this little strip here. It was actually the strip behind it, which has to do with motor control, but you don't need to know that. They wanted to see how things shifted around with the representation of the fingers on that little strip of the brain. And so they first did a brain image scanning before they practiced, and then they let people practice for 2 hours, and then they did another one. Then they did another brain scan, and they wanted to see if people's brains had shifted around to make more room for the fingers that were being used. And I think it was just the right-hand fingers that played this melody, by the way. Okay. What they found was that people's brains did change after 2 hours of practice. A little bit, they did change. But then when they came back the next day for their second of the 5 days of practice, okay, they scanned them before they went through the practice. And they found that their brains had reverted back to where it was at baseline before they had learned any of the keyboard pattern, okay? So basically you come in, your brain is scanned. There's no extra space given to those fingers. You practice for 2 hours, your brain is scanned again. Oh, look, yeah, there's a little bit more room given to those two fingers. Okay, see you tomorrow. You come back, your brain is scanned before the practice. Your brain has reverted back to its original state. You practice for 2 hours. Okay, good. It's changed a little bit again. And you do this for 5 days. And each time they scan you before the practice session and right after the practice session. And what you find is, yes, the brain organization appears after each practice session. But before the practice sessions, even on the 5th day, okay, the brain was always reverting back to its original state. Now, you probably did see improvements, right? You probably did see improvements in the skill. You know, the nice thing about hooking this thing up to the computer is not only did it make a sound, right, but also they can measure how accurate and how smoothly you're doing this. And yeah, you're getting a little bit better, but when it comes to what's going on with your brain's representation of those fingers, there's not a lot of change, okay, in the beginning. The change they see is after the practice. Cool. Thank you for your help, group 1. Group 2, I got a surprise for you. You're going to continue this for 4 more weeks. What? Yeah. Group 1, go home. We might give you a call later. Group 2, 4 weeks of practice. So the subjects go home and practice for 4 weeks in the same manner. I think they practice every day for 2 hours. It's the exact same pattern. And they set up a cute little piece of software, so they got feedback on how they were doing and all that sort of stuff. Probably fun feedback to make it more long lasting, right? And after 4 weeks, they bring both groups of subjects back into the lab and kind of rerun what they ran in the beginning. They have them come in and they do baseline testing before their little 2-hour session, and then testing afterwards. And guess what happens? Okay, this time, the group that took the little keyboard home and practiced for 4 weeks, when they came in and had their baseline testing done before they start doing the 2 hours, okay, their brains looked as if they had done the 2 hours of practicing already. Their brain reorganization appears before their little practice session. The group that didn't do the 4 weeks of practicing, their brain had reverted. They do their 2 hours and then they show more area dedicated to the fingers. But this group, when they came in, even without touching a keyboard on that day, okay, because they had practiced for 4 weeks, their brain has already showed this more area dedicated to the involved fingers. In other words, they had established long-term plasticity. Okay, does that make sense to you? That their changes have been sustained. Clearly, this group was also much better at the skill. In fact, I anecdotally, I believe that some of these folks went on and decided to take piano lessons. They were really enjoying it, and they got noticeably better after 4 weeks. You can imagine 2 hours a day for 4 weeks. You're going to learn this pattern really well, and probably want to learn a little bit more. But the most interesting thing for our purposes today is that they do show this kind of sustained brain change that allows them to have this kind of long-term learning. And it happens from their short-term plasticity becoming long-term plasticity. Okay. Hopefully you got this. I tried to make it as intuitive as possible. If you're confused about this, think back to my scenario of ruining my apartment when I was a graduate student. We didn't actually knock through the walls with hammers, but we did take the door off, and yeah, it's kind of a nice little metaphor for short-term plasticity, kind of establishing long-term plasticity. Okay, cool. Let's continue with this. I'm just going to slide here. Shoot. Okay. Now, let me just see something here. Yes. There was a follow-up experiment to this. And the follow-up experiment involved not having people physically practice the keyboard pattern, but having them imagine themselves playing the keyboard pattern. So at first they are taught the keyboard pattern physically, they do it on the keys. But then they go home for 4 days and they aren't given the keyboard. I think they are given the keyboard, but they're told not to touch the keyboard at all. Just put it in front of them, or maybe it was as a picture of a keyboard to help them imagine themselves playing it. But they said, keep your hands to your side, Don't move your fingers. Just close your eyes or look at the keyboard and imagine your fingers practicing the pattern. Okay. And they did this for a shorter period of time, I believe. Yeah, 4 days. And in fact, what they found was there was an improvement in performance from the mental practice. And there were corresponding brain changes. Now, it was 4 days, so it was short-term plasticity, certainly. But they did show improvements in how accurate they were relative to another group that didn't do the mental practice. And they did show more dramatic brain changes as a result of that mental practice. And maybe you've heard of this sort of thing before. You know, if you follow sports, sometimes athletes talk about mental practice. I know that I heard a couple of the Olympic athletes talk about the mental practice that they do to kind of help. And yes, it helps with things like concentration, and it helps relax them maybe, and things like that. But it also, to some degree, does induce the same type of brain changes that occur when you physically practice something. If you say you want to improve your foul shots or something like that, and basketball players will talk about this, that, you know, they're on the bus, they have nothing else to do as they're going to the games, they're on the bus, and what they'll do is they'll close their eyes and imagine themselves shooting foul shots accurately, and they'll try to get it as detailed as possible. That's one of the things that seems to matter. And it's very important that you imagine the foul shooting from your perspective, the shooter's perspective. If you're asked to imagine yourself as a third person or somebody sitting on the bench watching you make the shots, it doesn't work as nearly as well. It seems to work much more effectively if it's from your position that you're doing this mental practice. And it does actually induce improvements in performance and some corresponding brain changes that you would expect to see if people were actually doing the physical practice, which is really interesting. Yeah, same plasticity as physical practice, it says here. Other examples about this where concentrating on something, or having an experience. And actually, I can't remember if you guys did, I think you guys did rubber hand, right? You guys do rubber hand? I think you did that. This is another example of that, and it's discussed in the book in the same context, absolutely. Let's just see here. No problem. But let's talk about another example of this. And this is Tai Chi, and that's what you're seeing here. This is a Tai Chi practitioner, and you might have said this type of, it's a kind of like a cross between martial arts and like ballet almost. And this is the sort of thing you see in commercials for, various medications for, older folks. You see them practicing Tai Chi out in a park somewhere or something like that. It's like you're doing this type of thing and you're moving around. And my parents did it for a long time. They lived in a retirement community, and it was, you could drive through the retirement community and see, groups of people doing this. It's pretty. My parents loved it. They said it really kind of helped their kind of center balance, and they felt they got some strength training out of it, because it's, it's very precise movements. Right? I mean, it's not like you're just kind of haphazardly doing it, and you really have to, try to concentrate on the smoothness of it and everything. But one other thing you concentrate on is your fingertips. And it's kind of interesting. You can see here that the fingertips really don't physically touch anything, but they are told to kind of concentrate on their fingers, and in order to kind of render the movements as smoothly as possible, to imagine kind of like lasers or light beams kind of emanating from your fingertips. So when you move across like this, you're kind of painting the scene in front of you, the trees, the other people, with these light beams kind of emanating from your fingers. And it's not, it's not supposed to, kind of be metaphysical or anything like that. It's just like, let's try to make your movements as smooth as possible. And so imagine that there's light beams coming from your fingers and you're painting across what's in front of you. It's just a way of them concentrating to get their movements smooth. That's all. Light beams don't really come out. No one believes light beams comes out, but it just helps them become more smooth. And as they do that, what happens is you find that even though these people have no experience touching anything, their experience of concentrating on their fingertips and intensely concentrating on their fingertips, right? It's something the teacher will tell them to do. Imagine your fingers are what's guiding you. Your fingertips are what's, are leading your body, okay? And you need to keep them as steady as possible. What it actually ends up doing, so there's no actual contact in this, what it actually ends up doing is enhancing touch sensitivity. And the touch sensitivity can be measured this way. It can be measured with that little tool we saw before. Yeah, I actually brought this in. It's not even that important. It's just determining how many points there are, 1 or 2, that sort of thing, or whether the grid is positioned horizontally or vertically across your fingertips, right? Like this. People who do Tai Chi and are told to have this concentration will show enhanced sensitivity to their fingers, to touching on their fingers, even though their fingers are never making contact with anything during these exercises. It's another example of how what you're thinking about, how what you're concentrating on can have an influence over your touch sensitivity and probably plasticity as well. I don't know if people in this experiment were scanned. I don't know if their brains were scanned, but probably in other similar sorts of experiments they were. It's very cool. Finally, and this one I do know did involve some scanning. This is a cool experiment. This is an experiment where people go into the laboratory and they put just their 4 fingers. I can't see the bottom image here. Shoot, sorry. Drives me nuts. I can't see if the thumb's on there. Okay, that's fine. They have 4 fingers. Yeah, it's 4 fingers. They have 4 fingers touching kind of like this grid of holes, basically. And they're told that they're going to be kind of keeping track of the stimulation that is occurring on these fingers. Underneath the little holes that they can't see, they're little, very small, but little like rubber brushes that kind of brush up against the fingers. And they brush up against the fingers in different directions, like this, with different patterns. So, maybe this finger gets stimulated and then this one gets stimulated and then this one gets stimulated and then this one gets stimulated with these little brushes. I guess it's on a little treadmill underneath, so they can set it up in it whatever they want. And they get this complex pattern and they are asked to do one of 2 things. One group of subjects is asked to keep track of which finger gets stimulated. What's the pattern of fingers? So you'd say, okay, index finger, pinky, ring finger, middle finger, pinky. Okay, it'd be something like that. All right. The other group of subjects gets the exact same pattern, and all their fingers are being stimulated, but they're asked to concentrate on just one of those fingers and to say whether the brush is going forward or backward on their finger. Okay, so concentrate on your index finger, forward, forward, backward, forward, that sort of thing. So, and at the same time, all their other fingers are stimulated, but they are concentrating on a different part of that stimulation. So one group concentrates on the pattern across all 4 fingers. The other group concentrates on just one finger, okay? And what this I guess occurs for a number of hours. They're reporting this sort of information. They're concentrating on either a single finger or across the finger, and then they're scanned. What you find is that the part of their touch brain that is going to be shifting will depend on what they're concentrating on, okay? Everybody's getting the exact same stimulation. Everyone's getting all 4 fingers stimulated in these weird patterns with these little, brush things that are going on them. But what ends up changing in the brain, how the brain shifts to make room for these different, the different types of stimulation, will depend on whether you're concentrating on a single finger or all 4 fingers. You're concentrating on a single finger. There's more area dedicated to that single finger in the touch brain area, the touch cortex. If in fact you're concentrating on all 4 fingers, then there is kind of a equal amount of area enlarging for each of the 4 fingers. So it's not just how you're being stimulated, right? It's not just how you're being stimulated. It is how your concentration, how your attention is being drawn to different parts of that stimulation. It's an important fact. Okay, how are we doing here? Okay, good. Yeah, let's just go on to this last slide on this aspect of touch. And meet somebody who was just a wonderful person, allowed me to talk to him. That's not him up there. His name, the person I talked to, I don't have a picture of him, is Ben Curry. He was an older gentleman. Ben had just had an amputation, and it's tough. It really is a traumatic thing to have an amputation. He was in his 60s, I think, but he had pretty severe diabetes. What happened was, when you have severe diabetes, sometimes your sense of touch, your awareness of what's going on with your lower extremities becomes such that you don't know if you have an injury. And this is really sad, but what happened was he had I guess a injury to one of his toes. He was unaware that he was injured to the extent that he actually was. That injury, because I think also diabetes kind of hastens the infections and stuff like that. He very quickly ended up with a lower leg infection, and then did have to have his left leg amputated below his knee. And he was still in the hospital when I talked to him, and he was very gracious, very, very willing to talk about what it was like and what his experience of this was like. I really was very appreciative, very open, kind of, very, kind of sensitive guy. He was very willing to talk about it. He said it was really hard, really, really hard. He said he had lost family members. One of his siblings had died a few years earlier. He lost both parents, and he said that he had never mourned more than when he lost his leg. He really felt like he didn't realize how much of a mourning experience it would be, and as he's talking about it, I can understand. It's very sad. But what we wanted to talk about a little bit, because he had told a physician friend of mine who was able to connect me with Ben, he told my friend that he did have pain in his lower leg that had been amputated. And it wasn't terrible, it was moderate pain, but it was a known phenomenon. This is called phantom pain. So, even though he had had even though he had had his lower left leg amputated, he was feeling pain in his in his left leg foot, even though it didn't exist anymore, even though it wasn't part of his body anymore. And this is called phantom pain. You've probably heard about this sort of thing, and it does happen. It wasn't terrible, but it was enough that he told my buddy, the physician, about this, and we talked about it. It didn't happen right away either. He said it took him about 2 weeks after the amputation. He then started feeling it, and he'd look at, down there, and he'd say, I know my leg's not there, but my God, I really do feel pain down there. By the way, this was the toe where the infection had initially set in, and that's also somewhat common with individuals that have phantom pain or sometimes much lighter experience called phantom sensation, that they feel it in the part of the body that's been removed, but in the part that's been removed that at one point did have pain before, where the damage had occurred. In this case, it was an infection starting in that toe when he was feeling it. And he said, listen, I know what this is. I was told that this is a possibility. I might have this, but I sometimes go and reach down to the empty space where my toe would have been, or my toe would be, and I rub it. And I do this, and it makes me feel better. He said, I know when I do this that, there's something kind of very odd about it. If you were to see me, across the room rubbing space, you would think it's very odd, but it helps. It helps a little bit. And what he said, I think, was really insightful here. He said, I know I've learned about phantom pain. I've learned about what's going on in the brain a little bit. And so what I feel like I'm doing is I'm kind of patronizing my brain as I rub my toe, as I scratch down there. I'm kind of trying to make my brain feel better, which was a really insightful thing, because he knew a little bit about what goes on with the brain when a person has an amputation, and that to some degree, in order to relieve this sort of thing, you need to do a little almost tricking of your brain. You need to kind of pay attention to the touch areas of your brain. He knew this to kind of help me. So help him. So he was instructed a little bit about this, and he said that's really been helpful. Now, as it turns out, the majority of folks that have amputations don't have phantom pain. They don't have a lot of necessarily a phantom pain. I can't remember what it is now, 30% or something, might be less than that. But almost everybody does have what's called phantom sensation, which means they do feel something. Maybe they feel a tingling in the foot that has been removed. Maybe they feel it itches a little bit. It's not necessarily a painful thing, but it is at least initially a kind of odd, disarming thing, right? It does feel a little strange. And it's a little, kind of shocking when you feel a sensation in a part of your body that doesn't exist anymore, as you can imagine. In the old days, they thought that this type of thing was related to maybe the emotional trauma that individuals go through when they have an amputation. And it is an emotional trauma. There's no question. Ben was very clear on that. I've talked to other folks that have had amputations. They say it's a part of your body you've lived with all your life, and you look down there and it's not there. It's such a loss. There is emotional trauma. So they used to think that the emotional trauma is maybe what kicked in the phantom sensations, the phantom pains, or when they did the surgery, maybe there was some sort of nerve damage at the stump, that remaining stump, that caused this sort of thing. And so sometimes they would do an additional surgery to try to cut the nerves differently or something like that. They would put people into counseling or something like that to help with the emotional trauma, thinking that would get rid of the phantom sensation, the phantom pain. But now, since we've learned so much about plasticity, I think we have a much better sense of what's going on. When we lose a part of our body, the brain kind of doesn't know how to handle it and has to shift around its sensory area dramatically and quickly, right? If you lose that, imagine looking at that. Yeah, there. Oh, you have it on your slide there, right? All of a sudden there's this vacated part. There's this empty part of the map, in a sense, right? Your lower leg's no longer there. So what's going to happen? Well, another body part's kind of sensations are going to now kind of take over that part of the map, right? And it happens dramatically sometimes. It's sometimes called overexuberant or kind of dramatic neuroplasticity. And what we find in research like this, we as the general scientists, I don't do research on this, is that the more dramatic the reorganization, the more pain a person is likely to have. So with somebody like Ben, and in fact, this is what they found 2 weeks after it was over, the surgery was over, and he started experiencing this pain, they went and did a little brain scan, and they found that, yeah, in fact, he had showed this radical kind of change in his brain, his sensory map here, his touch map on his brain. Other parts of his body kind of dramatically took over. And they can now make predictions that if there's pain, or if there's pain, it's likely going to be a dramatic map. If it's a dramatic map change, it's likely going to be more pain. One thing that they find is that the more distant the body parts, and I don't remember what Ben's exact situation was, but what do we have here? Yeah. So say that you lose your hand. Okay, so you have to have, your hand has to be amputated for you get an accident or something like that, something terrible like that. What could take over that space? And if you look at the little map here, yeah, can I do this? Yeah, I can do that. Good. If you look at the little map here, you can see that there are different things that can take over this little space that's now left over from the hand. It's the arm that can take over this space, or the face. If the arm now takes over this space, okay, there's less likely to be phantom pain or phantom sensation than if the face takes over this space, right? You can see what's next to it, right? You lose your hand, this area right here becomes opened, and so other sorts of body parts, maps can take over. If the arm takes over, you're okay. If the face takes over, though, chances are you're going to have more phantom pain, because what they find is that the more distant the body part is from the one that's lost, that takes over that space, the more pain you're going to have, right? Your arm is obviously very close to your hand, so you're not going to, there's not a lot of distance. And if this part of your body now takes over the map, you should be okay. But, your face is really far away from your hand. So if the face takes over that, you're very likely to have more pain, okay? There's still a lot of questions about how this works, what causes it. I think now we feel better about what we can tell patients. Okay, we can tell patients this is not emotional trauma you might be having. Certainly, we don't want to belittle what you're going through emotionally, but these phantom sensations and the phantom pain is not a result of any sort of psychological weakness or emotional weakness or anything like that. This is just your brain kind of shifting around, this is something that they're trying to now address with various therapies that might be able to help this type of thing. And last I looked, there was some moderate success with these therapies, but they're worth talking about, these new treatments. One of the things is called a mirror box. And actually, I believe that this is just a person that has not had can you see this here? Yeah, okay. So this is not a person who's had an amputation, but imagine they had their left hand amputated here. What they're doing here is they're putting their right hand into the box, right? And they're looking on this surface right here, which is a mirror image of their right hand, okay? So they're seeing something that would look like where their left hand, which has been amputated, would be. Okay. Say they have pain in that hand, and one thing that happens with people that have phantom pain in their amputated hand is they feel like it's clenched, and they can't unclench it. They can't open their hand. They don't have that ability, so they feel this kind of phantom muscle tension and phantom pain where their nails might be digging into their skin. If in fact they look into the mirror box and open their right hand, can I see this? Yeah, open their right hand so it looks like their left hand is opening in that mirror image, they tend to be able to relieve some of that discomfort. Again, it's like what Ben's saying, that they're patronizing their touch brain here. They're helping their touch brain kind of feel better. Just making up these kind of odd interpretations, but kind of find the transition easier. And it does, there is some success with these things. Virtual reality too, you can imagine, you could do the whole thing with virtual reality and you're looking at your hands, so you have goggles on, you're looking at these hands. And, the virtual reality system is set up so you can unclench what would be your left hand as you're looking at it, right? And if you've seen this rubber hand illusion stuff, you know that there is this, kind of visual information that can affect how we experience touch and that sort of thing, and vice versa. So there is potential for treatments. Last I looked a few years ago about how well these sort of things work. They work better for some folks with phantom pain than others. So some of it is more long lasting than others. I think the individuals who find the mirror effects helpful, these mirror box effects helpful, have to do it every so often to kind of keep up with it. Might take many sessions, that sort of thing. But I think there is the potential there. The nice thing is, though, again, we can tell patients that it's not, the phantom pain, the phantom sensation is not a result of any sort of emotional weakness or anything like that. This is the way the brain reacts to dramatic changes that are induced by an amputation. Okay. Are there any questions about this before we take our little break here? Anything? Okay, let's take our break, 10-minute break. So let's see, what time do I have here? I got 11:37, so 11:47 we'll come back. Okay, we are back. What are we doing here? Good. Any questions on anything from before? So there was a chat. I'll respond that. Let's see here. Crystal, why don't you contact me? Why don't you email me? That'd be the best thing, and then we can just. I don't have time right after class, but I can make time for you. So go ahead and email me. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions? Let's do a practice question. I guess this would be a good time to do it. What do we got here? Yeah, this one would be very easy too. This is actually from last class's material, I believe. But we talked about this at the beginning of today's class, so you should do fine. Okay. When would you be using your visual brain to help you touch? A, after 5 days of visual deprivation. B, after 3 hours of visual deprivation. C, when trying to identify a spatially complex object by touch, for example, keys in your pocket. Or D, all of the above. Okay, here you go. All right, I'll give you another 20 seconds or so. Okay, that should do it. Let me share the results. Many of you've got this. The correct answer is D, all of the above. Remember, the first answer refers to the situation in which you would be checking into a hospital room and be blindfolded. And as you were blindfolded for 5 days, your visual brain area that's no longer working for vision would actually help you with touch. It would start shifting its use to touching, and that'd be true whether or not you actually were learning Braille, as we discussed. It does that either way. But then 3 hours of visual deprivation does the same thing, not quite as dramatically, but it also shows an enhanced touch sensitivity with the visual brain being involved in that type of skill. And then finally, we talked about the visual brain helping you in the kind of more everyday scenario where you'd be feeling around for a key. So it's actually in there in the question, in your pocket. That's the way you can remember this for the test. Imagine grabbing a key in your pocket and determining which key you're going to pull out to put into the lock using just touch. And in situations like that, it's thought that your visual brain, even though it's usually dedicated, or a lot of it's dedicated to vision, it will help you touch in that scenario. So the correct answer is all of the above, D. Okay, any question on that? Cool. All right, then let's continue our discussion. And we're going to shift a little bit here. And oops, hold on a second. Hold on. Oh boy, hold on a second. Oh, okay. All right, so let me share our screen. Sound and all this, cool. So we're going to continue talking about touch, but we're going to kind of change our, we're going to move away from plasticity, although plasticity will very much be relevant to what we're discussing. But we're going to spend time talking about kind of some unique demonstrations of touch that I think are really interesting. One of the things, oh, there we go. One of the things that we actually have researched in my lab is something I want to introduce to you by telling you about an individual, Rick Joy, who is sadly recently passed away, but I did have a chance to meet with him and spend time with him, and he really was a really wonderful guy, and really it's an amazing story. Rick lost his sight and hearing by the time he was 2 years of age, I think from meningitis. And I think he lost his sight first and then his hearing a little bit later. He did, you know, by the time you're 2, your language skills are you know, pretty good. And so he did have exposure to language and was speaking at that point, but then was totally deaf and blind by the time he was pretty much 2 years of age. Despite this, he had a wonderfully rich life. Even from the start, he, you know, was an avid swimmer, and he would be able to swim by he would, I guess, tie a rope to one of his friends who was swimming in front of him, and he would be able to track them that way. You know, kind of, I guess he had a rope around his shoulder or something like that, would do that. And he swam regularly when he was young. When he was high school, he was a Boy Scout and became the first blind deaf Eagle Scout in the country. Eagle Scout, if you know, is kind of the highest ranks of Boy Scouts. He then went on and received a college degree and went in engineering. I can't remember where he went, but he received it in engineering and then worked for 30 years at Hewlett-Packard, designing and creating circuit boards. He was a very, very bright guy. You know, it's interesting, but before I met him, I mean, you know, if you can kind of introspect for a second and imagine what it would be like to be both deaf and blind. I mean, I think either one of them has to be isolating a little bit, depending on your context. But to be both deaf and blind, I just imagined it would, you know, be maybe a very kind of isolating existence. But he is anything, or was anything but isolated. He was a very gregarious guy, you know, really very personable, very funny, had a lot of friends, and just a ton of fun to be around, and really was really pretty amazing. He had many, many hobbies. He would do construction on his house. Actually, he was telling me stories of doing roof work, and his neighbors would like see, they knew he was deaf and blind, they'd see him working at the roof and they would like run over with ladders trying to help him. And he was perfectly self-sufficient. He, you know, was very, very, you know, creative kind of genius guy, and figured out different ways of kind of, you know, making sure he would be safe up there and everything. He was what's called a radio hobbyist. And I don't know if you folks are aware of this at all, but before there was the internet, this was a popular thing when I was a kid. Yeah, at least you'd have one person on your street who was into this. It's called ham radio sometimes. It's amateur radio. And it was basically a very powerful sort of radio that you could set up in your home. And it's basically, it was a way of communicating with folks all over the world going through radio frequencies. So again, before the internet, you know, before cell phones and all that sort of stuff. This would be a way for people to talk to people, you know, in you know, different distant parts of the world, you know. There was a guy who lived next door to me that was a ham radio hobbyist, and, you know, had this, you know, I used to go over when I was a kid, and he had this giant map on his wall with, you know, pins in it showing all the places he was able to talk to, you know, people at. And it was, you know, that was kind of part of the thing. And, you know, you have conversations, and it was a big deal. You know, it was hard to reach people on the phone that way. You know, you could do it through regular landlines and stuff like that, but this was, you know, a free way of doing it. And these guys were also back then important in the sense that they were involved with any sort of emergency, you know, alert systems. Nowadays, it's less involved with that, but it was a very easy way. If there were, if the power went out, most of these folks had generators and stuff like that, and they could communicate around the world and stuff. Anyway, this is one of the things that Rick did, but you'd wonder how in the world could he do this, right? I mean, he can't read any, well, he can't see, so any sort of text message or something like that, they didn't have that back then, but he would need his hearing, you would think, at least. And one thing all these folks needed to do in order to be part of this emergency system is they needed to be able to communicate not just verbally, but they also needed to do it through Morse code. So he learned Morse code for this purpose and was able to do Morse code by, if you've ever seen a Morse code key, it's something you press like this. But the way you typically receive Morse code is through sound, but he couldn't. So what he did is he built this little speaker that would play the Morse code a little bit louder than usual, that he could feel with his finger. He would feel the speaker vibrate with his finger, and he'd be able to communicate with people around the world this way. It was really, really technically very skilled with these sorts of things, from his Hewlett-Packard work and everything. Other things I can tell you about him. Well, I'll tell you about the communication between us is important, and that's what you're seeing that here. That's what we're going to be spending most of our time talking about. The fact that the way I was able to interview him and get to know him was by having him feel my face, which is what you're seeing here. It's a very particular technique, and I'll tell you a little bit about the way in which he does that. But there were times where we would be talking, and all of a sudden his daughter would come in, and his daughter was like, I don't know, 5 or 6 at the time. It was absolutely adorable. She was hearing and sighted. His wife was deaf, but the daughter was hearing and sighted, and she was really cute and very energetic. And she would come in, and I was touching Rick's face. I'm sorry, while he was touching my face to understand me. The daughter would come in and sit next to me, and Rick would then address comments to her. And I said, how do you know that she was in the room? And he said that I could feel the boards of his wooden floor kind of shake. Whenever she comes in, the boards bounce a very specific way. And he said there's other ways too, like, if someone's very close behind him, he can sometimes just feel, breezes that are made by people kind of moving back and forth behind him. So he used to his boss used to come in to see how his work was going without saying anything, without attracting his attention. And he'd then be able to address him, say, hey, Bill, how's it going? How do you know I'm here? And he'd say, I can kind of feel you. I can, whether it's the floor is vibrating, the breezes on my neck, I can tell you're there, which was really, really impressive. And I say that, yeah, he does this home repair, which is amazing. So how did he get so good at these things? I mean, how did he really kind of work out a way in his life that he was able to, be so successful? I mean, he really, really was successful, both interpersonally and professionally. And, he said it was important to be able to communicate with people. I had to talk to my boss. I had to talk to people who worked for me. Back then, there weren't technologies that would allow, easy kind of translation to Braille and to touch or something like that. So he did need to learn to communicate with people through touching their face. And he started this rehabilitation when he was about 11. And he went to a specific school. It was a school that was started by Helen Keller, who I believe you've seen a video of. I don't know, you will if you haven't, and learned a little bit about her. But this is a technique of learning to touch people's faces to understand them. It's called the Tadoma technique. And that name was named after the first 2 people who were kind of formally taught or formally trained to use the technique, Tad and Oma, 2 kids. And it was established in the 1950s, and Helen Keller was one of the first folks to do it. And there you see Helen Keller touching the face of President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. If you've seen the video, you know about Helen Keller's life. She was, such an accomplished person, just generally, let alone for somebody who was deaf and blind since a very young age as well. wrote many books, did lots of public speaking, met dignitaries such as Eisenhower and a number of other presidents and leaders of the world. She would be able to communicate with them either through a translator if they were nearby. If somebody knew sign language, she would be able, and Rick did the same thing. You could sign into Rick's hand and Helen Keller's hand. There's enough information there that you could that Rick would hold. For example, his wife knew knew sign language, and that's how they would communicate. He would feel her hand in his hand, and he'd be able to do it. And Helen could do the same thing. But for the vast majority of people, they couldn't do that with. They would use this technique, and you can see the techniques are a tiny bit different there. Helen is touching the face using her index finger and other fingers up here. Rick's kind of doing something below. But I'll talk about what's really important for that configuration in just a second. It is exactly the same general type of thing they're doing. They're both using this method of touching faces for speech perception. They just have a little bit of a different style in doing it. These days, it's not as common to find people who use this technique, and there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, there aren't as many, let's hope this continues, there aren't as many deaf-blind people as there used to be. There used to be a much larger population of deaf-blind people as a result from rubella. So maybe you know that this MMR vaccine that you got, most of you got at least hopefully when you were kids, one of the things that it inoculates you against is rubella. But before they had that, rubella was not an uncommon disease, and one of the outcomes of getting rubella as a child would be to lose both hearing and sight. So let's hope that people continue to get vaccinated. As you know, that there are some people that feel there's controversy here, but I hope that rubella never comes back because of a lack of a vaccine. Anyway, that was one thing. Now there's definitely fewer people that have it. The other thing is, as you know, there's things like cochlear implants that can be given to a deaf child. And if they're deaf and blind, chances are that that would definitely be one of the options. As I said, there are devices like text-to-braille devices. Tactile sign is something these individuals will use if they have a translator there. So there aren't too many people that use this as their primary means of communication. When I met Rick, which was probably 2009 or so, he said there were about 20 people that he knew of in the country, but I think now there's less. I think there's probably between 10 and 15 users in the country that are documented. I mean, it could be that other people use the technique and we just don't know about them. But that's okay. Even if there aren't that many people that use it anymore as their primary means of communication, it's still a really interesting thing that this is something that can be done in general. The fact that you can understand speech well enough by touching a person's face to communicate with them. And so what was it like for me? Well, for me, it was like talking to somebody that had a moderate hearing loss in a noisy restaurant. So if you've gone out to dinner and gone to a restaurant with your grandparents, you know, and they might have a tiny bit of a hearing loss, every once in a while, they might ask you to repeat yourself a little bit. Maybe if it were really noisy, you might talk a little bit more slowly. And that's what it was like with Rick. You know, again, don't forget, he's doing nothing but touching my face in order to get my speech. And there were a few times I needed to repeat myself, but not that often. And I did find myself talking a little bit more slowly and keeping the sentences a little bit simpler, but it was not a problem. He understood a majority of what I was saying by touching my face. You know, some talkers, he said, are easier than others. Men are the easiest, and it's not for any other reason besides the fact that the voice box here, the Adam's apple, is more prominent in men and can be more easily felt, and that turns out to be an important part of what's being felt here. You know, as Rick's doing it, he's got his fingers down here. Helen had her thumb down here on the voice box as well. It's important that something be touching around here. And because men's Adam's apples voice boxes are more are more prominent, they're easier to feel. Women are a little bit more difficult. He said children are very tough. He said that you know, even though he has a lot of experience with his daughter, she is still very difficult. And she was learning sign language and would certainly, you know, be working towards signing into Rick's hands, I'm sure. But he had trouble touching her face and understanding what she was saying. So there were certainly talker differences, and also, you know, lower voices, not just the prominence here, but also the fact that the voice is lower allows for more vibration. So the more vibration they can feel here, the better. Okay. What about these hand configurations? Well, what Helen's doing is actually there weren't a lot of people that did what Helen's doing up there, where the fingers are like this. I think people found that, I think that a lot of the Todoma users thought that was maybe a little bit more intrusive, and Rick wanted people to feel comfortable by doing it. So the most common way of doing it is actually to put the fingers down here on the Adam's apple. So hopefully you can see this, yeah, like this. And then one finger across here around the jawline, and then the thumb across the lips like this. And the idea here is you'd be feeling what the lips are doing, but also feeling, importantly, the air that's being expressed. So you know that you know, if you do this now and go Sally, you can feel the air, or you say pot, you can feel the air versus bot, pot, bot, you can feel the air there. Now, Rick, as you can see from that picture, felt that he was concerned that people would find that a little less hygienic. This was long before COVID, of course. But he would put his thumb right down there at the lower lip. And he felt that if it was just right there, he would still be able to feel the air, but not have it covering the lips. And that's how Rick did it. And you can see he actually has his hand curved a little bit. But as long as you're feeling, you know, the jaw move up and down, importantly, the voice box and its vibrations and what the lips are doing, that is typically how it's done. Now, to teach somebody to do this, it's kind of like an imitation kind of game. I actually have to. So the teacher would have the hands of the children on their face and make a sound or maybe say a word like pot, pot, something like that. And then have the child feel their own face and try to imitate it. And from kind of going back and forth and feeling their own face and how their own articulators are producing the thing that they just felt the teacher do, they would become kind of more familiar with how the different movements they're feeling are conveying different words. It is certainly much easier if the child has already had some experience with language. So Rick had experience. He had, 2 years worth of language through hearing and at least a year through seeing. But if they don't know language, that's another story. That can be very difficult to actually teach a child the concept of language without having hearing or seeing. And that was the case with Helen. And if you've ever seen movies or the kind of the biographies about her or her own writing, it was a very interesting process where she actually had to be taught what the concept of language was as representing it, as face movements, as lip movements, and vocalizations through touch, representing things in the world without, you can imagine, without knowing that's something that exists. That would be a hard thing to teach, and it took Helen some time. But it's really, I mean, even if it's not used very often anymore, it's interesting in that it can be used. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of the research that's been done. It actually, it's been studied on and off. Sometimes it is studied with people that do this as their main means of communication. Other times it's done with novices, which is interesting. So you can bring in novices. And actually, as I said earlier, we actually have done things like this in my laboratory. We have a couple of projects. We are actually asking people to touch faces for the purposes of being able to train them on being able to understand distorted speech better. Now, I'll talk about this in just a second. Yeah. You have subjects come in and tell them about this a little bit. So let's talk about this with with naive subjects that have never done it. We're talking about like intro psychology students who've not done this ever. You have them come into the laboratory and you tell them a little bit about Tadoma, and then you have them touch their own face a little bit and talk. See, can you feel like, you know, the lips closing? Can you feel like the air coming? Can you feel how, importantly, how the timing of the lips parting is coordinated with the vibrations here? And you kind of teach them a little bit, but not very much, maybe, you know, an hour's worth of this type of thing. And then you have them do their very best at trying to, you know, touch somebody's face and understand, you know, syllables, maybe. Pa, you can imagine this, pa versus da, or sha versus sa, even that, you can actually feel the difference there. It's interesting. And just try to do syllables. Okay, do the best they can. And what you find is something very interesting, even with novices, that even though they're touching, okay, their auditory brain and their visual brain areas start to get activated. This is certainly true with people who have experience, like someone like Rick Joy. He wasn't any of these experiments, but the few people that are still around using this as their main language technique, this is the case, that they will activate their visual and auditory areas as they're touching speech. They're blindfolded, they have headphones on, they're not hearing or seeing speech. They're touching speech, but their visual brain areas and auditory brain areas start lighting up, okay? And this is the case not just for people who use this as their main means of communication. It's true of you and me, who have probably never touched faces, or, you know, except for this one hour training, have ever touched faces for the purposes of speech perception before, okay? Your auditory brain, in fact, that's kind of one of the more interesting things. Your auditory brain is really kind of almost acting as if you're hearing the speech, okay? It's acting as if you're hearing the speech. So we'll talk about that in just a second, a little bit more. How much can be perceived? So how good can people get at this? Well, as I said, Rick was really terrific. Helen Keller was really terrific. Rick was able to understand me well enough that it was like talking to my grandparents in a noisy restaurant. Yeah, but it was good. If the sentences are slow, what you find in general in the research, what it suggests is that that they can be up to 90% of getting 90% of speech at slow speaking rates, which is a lot. Again, this is without any sound. This is without any lip reading or anything like this. This is lip feeling, basically. And that is a lot of speech that can be gained just through touch. Here you see this is cool. This is somebody having a conversation, a three-way conversation, and you do see they used to do this at the schools. You know, once they started getting good at this, they would have people have more than just discussions with trainers. They would then have them have discussions with each other where they're touching each other's face, and they would bring in a third person and have a three-way conversation. You know, just like we would, which was pretty amazing. So I mean, it's like, as I said, I already said this. It's similar to talking to somebody with some background sound, where you do have to repeat yourself and talk slowly. So imagine yourself at a party or a rave or something like that. You don't have to yell to these folks. You just need to talk a little bit more purposefully and a little bit more slowly, that sort of thing. Is this something that you can do? Well, if you want to spend the rest of your summer home, don't feel like going out for quarantine reasons or something like that, you could dedicate 100 hours to this and learn it as well as Rick Joy. That's about, they back in the 70s, they tried this with a number of undergraduate students that were willing to get paid to do this. And they found that by going through the kind of normal training steps that are done with the blind and deaf, if people are wearing headphones so they can't hear anything, if they are wearing a mask so they can't see anything, about 100 hours of training will get you to the point where you could understand people pretty well, 90% of the time, by touching their face, which is pretty amazing, 100 hours of training, it's like what, doing full time for 2.5 weeks. That's pretty impressive. It's a lot of training, of course, but but it's you know, you could potentially do this, you know, within a month, which is amazing. But maybe what's even more amazing, I think, from a kind of a scientific perspective, is that what I mentioned before, your brain can kind of do a little of this right away. Now, again, you can't understand sentences. Like if you want to go home and try this with your significant other or something like that, you're not going to understand a lot of what they're saying. You'll be able to get some syllables. But it's how the brain responds to felt speech in folks that have never used it before. Okay, so normal sighted and hearing individuals that have no training. So this is going back to bringing our intro psych students into the lab and asking them to feel, you know, a person's face when they really have never done it before. And in this case, it's no training. I mean, it's not even, you know, what I mentioned before with those brain imaging studies. Folks come in. I saw these experiments being conducted in another laboratory. We have done similar stuff in my laboratory, so I know how this works. You wear a rubber glove. By the way, we haven't been able to do this since quarantine, as you'll see. But you have people come in, you ask them to put on a rubber glove, you tell them a little bit about what they're going to be doing, and you say the blind and deaf can do this. And then you just have them try to distinguish between 3 or 4 syllables, right? And they can do it fairly well. And then there's a lot of things you can test them on. One thing you can test them on is this. You can play them speech through headphones that has a lot of background sound. So, you know, basically what you could do is you could take the speech of the person whose face they're feeling with a microphone, put it through the computer, add noise to it so it comes to the subjects with headphones. And it's so noisy, they aren't going to be able to understand very much of it, okay? But if they are feeling the person's face, they'll understand a lot more of it. So again, they're blindfolded here. And if they're just listening to that person, I'm getting maybe out of, you know, a 5-word sentence, maybe I'm getting 1 word, maybe, usually often less than that, because there's so much background noise. It's a sound like this, called white noise, background noise. It's hard to hear sentences that are quiet if that's in the background. But if you are feeling a person's face, okay, even though you've never done that for speech purposes before, okay, you will be able to understand more speech. You'll go from like 1 out of 5 words to say 3 out of 5 words per sentence. And you'll say, you know, this is really weird. I'm really able to understand the speech better. The experience is interesting too, by the way. I've been in these experiments. It almost sounds like what you're hearing is louder and clearer, even though what's coming to your ears hasn't changed. What's changed is that you're getting the speech information through another channel, okay? Even though you've never done that before, probably. And you know, there's another thing you can do if you're interested. You can do this as a lip reading test. So now what you do is you make sure you put headphones on and earplugs, and you make sure that your subjects, who are, again, introductory psychology students, are coming into the lab and have no sound from the speaker, okay? But they are able to see them now. They're no longer wearing a blindfold, and they're asked to lip read them. And, you know, if you've ever tried this type of thing, we'll be talking about lip reading in detail very soon. But if you've ever tried this sort of thing, most of us aren't very good at lip reading. It's kind of the same thing. We're not good at straight silent lip reading, I should say. You're looking at the face and you're not hearing anything. You're just watching the face. And if it's 5-word sentences, you know, very simple sentence, the football game is over, the flowers are on the table, maybe you get 1 word out of each of those. But if you then touch the face of the speaker, you're not getting any sound. Touching the face of the speaker gives you an additional 2 or 3 words per sentence. Okay, again, you've never done this before. Your brain has not been exposed to felt speech before, but it enhances the information you're getting auditorily through noisy speech, if it's distorted, or even visually, which is something we don't do very often with any sort of intent, right? So, you know, when we tell subjects in these sort of experiments, I didn't do these, but as you'll see, we do something similar. You tell subjects that they're going to be doing this and say, there's just no way there's no way this is going to help. This is going to do anything. I've never touched a face before. This is the silliest thing I've ever done. And it's awkward. You know, obviously at first they have to get used to touching and, you know, our experimenters' faces even with a rubber glove. It's, you can imagine, it takes a little while for them to get used to it. But once they feel comfortable doing it, and they are given a situation where they're hearing distorted speech or they're lip reading, what they feel can enhance what they are either hearing or seeing, okay? Which is really interesting. Let me just tell you a little aside about the experiments that we've conducted in our lab. It's kind of similar to this with distorted speech, because we're interested in whether this type of technique, this face touching technique, might help people with cochlear implants better use their implant. We have a way in our lab of kind of simulating cochlear implant speech. And cochlear implant speech, I could play you an example of it, but it kind of just sounds like, it sounds a little bit like very raspy Donald Duck speech. If you've ever seen the movie, what is it called? Sound of Metal, it's terrific. It's an intense movie, but if, you know, I recommend it if you don't mind a little intensity in there. The simulations they do there are good. The simulations they do in that movie are good, of cochlear implants. So we have something similar where we play a simulation of cochlear implant speech to our intro psychology students who come to the lab. And what we do is we ask them first to try to understand whatever words they can, and they have a hard time doing it. And then during a training session, we ask them to touch the face of the speaker as they're listening to the kind of cochlear implanted simulated speech. And now they do better, just like, you know, we said before with that noisy speech, they do better. But the question is now, after we remove the face and have them listen to the cochlear implant speech again on its own, have they been trained enough to now be better with it? And the answer is yes. So not only does touching a face help you better understand that distorted speech as it's being presented to you, it helps you learn to use that distorted speech better later on when you're not touching the face. It helps you kind of train to better hear that speech later on, which is really interesting. We've been working on that. We've had to take a hiatus from that, obviously, from quarantine. That's one of the last experiments I'm sure we'll be able to do during this time period. But yeah, it's an interesting finding. And then one other finding I wanted to tell you about with regard to this, and this was a very kind of surprising finding. This isn't my lab, this is somebody else, where subjects came in and they were given, you know, really no training at all. They were just asked if they could distinguish between ba and da and va. Okay, like that. And after, you know, most people would say after maybe 1 or 2 presentations of ba, da, va. If you try this on yourself, you probably be able to ba, da, va. You know, you can kind of feel those differences on the lips there. People can do it. They can distinguish those things within the first few minutes when they try it on the experimenter's face. And then what they'll do is, as the person, the subject is feeling an experimenter going ba or va or da, they will play in the subject's headphones a different syllable, okay? A syllable that is different from the one they are feeling, but that is synchronized to it. So let me just give you an example. Say you're feeling the experimenter's face and they are repeating silently, va, 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 like that. But what's coming through the headphones in a synchronous way to what they're feeling is the syllable ba, okay? Ba, ba, ba. So through the headphones, they're hearing ba. What they're feeling on the face is va. What subjects often report hearing through the headphones, it's clear, it's not distorted, hearing through the headphones is something influenced by what they're feeling. It's, in fact, maybe they'll say, I'm hearing va, even though what their ears are actually getting are ba, okay? So in other words, what they're feeling on the face is influencing what they're hearing, which I think is kind of interesting. It suggests that even if you've never felt speech before, if you've never touched a face for speech perception before, it's like your auditory brain area, we know that's involved here, is looking for whatever speech information it can find. And often it's going to come through hearing. Sometimes it's going to come through sight, as you'll see. We'll talk about those influences as well. But even in this case, where you've never touched a face for speech, this is a channel you've never used before for speech, you're touching the face and it's integrating all this information it can get. Okay, it's integrating information that you've never experienced before with the information you're getting through sound to, make some determination on what the person is saying. So it's as if that part of your brain that's responsible for speech perception wants its information from any sensory channel. Okay, and it's going to integrate that information from any sensory channel. It just wants to know what a person is saying, even if it gets it through touching a face, which is really interesting. We used to think of speech as pretty much an auditory thing, right there in the auditory brain, but now we know that little auditory brain information can even be influenced by touching a face, even if you've never done it for speech perception purposes before. Okay, any questions on this cool example? Right. Then let's do another practice question here, our last of the day, and then switch our topics a little bit. All right, this one is from earlier in our lecture on the tongue display unit. Yes. All right. Having a patterned electrode activity on your tongue with the tongue display unit, A, allows you to perceive lines and curves of various orientations. B, allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body instead of on the tongue after some practice. C, induces activity in visual brain regions after some practice. Or D, all of the above. And you should have no problem with this one. All right, how are we doing here? I'll give you another 20 seconds or so. Yeah, most of you guys are getting this, no problem. Okay, terrific. All of you got it right. The correct answer is D, and it should be very easy because we just went through this, that the tongue display unit does, at least initially, you got maybe a tiny bit of feedback. It does help you perceive lines and curves of different orientations. Remember, the reporter was able to do it after a couple of tries. It allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body. And I think that's one of the most interesting things, that when we believe that when the visual cortex gets involved and really helps out these situations, that's when you start to perceive more than just stimulation on your tongue that you then have to kind of consciously translate. That's when you start actually experiencing things outside the body, as if they really are there in front of you, almost as if it's a visual system that's involved here. And yes, of course, it does induce activity in the visual brain regions. That was the whole point of our discussion of it in that context, that cross-sensory compensation, cross-sensory plasticity sort of point. Okay, so the correct answer here is D. Good job. All right, so let's go back to our slide. Let's pull this down. All right. And I'd like to shift our concentration a little bit here and talk about this concept of being able to feel things without touching them. And I realize that's, one thing my editor said that I should do is make my chapter titles, oh shoot, hold on a second. My chapter title is a little kind of provocative. In other words, make them kind of, what does he mean by this? That type of thing. And so, oh man, hold on just a second. I apologize. Where did it go? Ah! I lost my image of myself. Maybe it is a good thing in my case. Hold on a second. I have no, it just disappeared. Okay, I'm assuming you can still see it. And if you can't, I apologize. Yeah, oh my gosh. Okay. Hopefully my face is still somewhere that will hopefully, you can see me talking. It's, no one's hopeful for my face being there, but you can see me talking. This whole idea of feeling things without touching them, it just, it's an idea that was, that title is kind of supposed to be mysterious, but it doesn't mean anything that interesting. What I'm going to be talking about here is being able to, kind of determine things from our sense of touch that we aren't in contact with skin-wise. And we've talked about these things before, right? We talked about this a little bit when we were discussing John Bramblett, and the fact that he's able to feel the kind of consistency, the density, the viscosity of paints, so he knows what he's mixing together by feeling the resistance of this viscosity to the brush as he kind of pulls it through the paint, right? If it's thick, if it's like a white, there'll be more resistance to the brush. If it's black, it's thin, it'll be less resistance to the brush. And so what he's doing is he's determining something about the paint's consistency, its viscosity, okay, without touching it. He's feeling the paint without touching it. What he's touching, what his skin is literally in contact with, is a tool, okay? Or yeah, a tool or some sort of device that is then being kind of used to do the direct contact of the thing that he wants to perceive. That's what I mean, okay, using tools more or less. However, it's going to be a little bit more than that, as you'll see. It's not just using a tool to feel something else, it's also being able to determine something about the tool itself. And the way we're able to do that is through a kind of interesting part of the kind of general touch system we use, okay? Let's go ahead and use one other example. I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to pick up, this is that cane I was using before when we were talking about echolocation, the cane for the blind people, blind folks. Boy, I'm hoping you can see me. What I'm doing here is, without looking at it, I'm kind of moving it back and forth, and I'm having a sense of how long this cane is by just doing this. Like, look at it, my skin's not feeling the entire length of the cane. It could if I wanted to, but I have a sense of how long it is just by doing this. And the reason I am is because there's something going on here with my tendons, things connecting the muscles to the bone here, and the muscles themselves that are telling my brain what type of changes are occurring as I go back and forth. Let me find something else here. I could just do this easily with my phone. Here we go. We all have phones. Okay. So say you just told me to hold out my fingers like this and grab it, and you didn't tell me where it was on the phone. This. He said, can you tell if you're grabbing it in the middle or on a side or in a corner, right? And I think you probably could do this, no problem, okay? You're only touching 2 points on the phone. I don't want to touch in here or anything like that. And you just swing it back and forth. Oh yeah, no, I'm at the edge and it feels like I'm more towards one side than the other. Yeah, there it is. That's exactly right. And that's an example of being able to feel something, the shape of something here, without really touching it. I am touching one thing, there's no question. My skin is touching something, but I'm able to tell something about what I am feeling without actually being in direct skin contact. What that is based on the muscle tendon system. That's what this is showing here. And I don't care that you know exactly what the hookups here are to the nervous system and all that sort of stuff, but there are little sensors here in the tendons where the bone connects to the muscles and stuff, and little sensors in the muscles themselves that are going to tell my brain how much, what sort of changes are occurring in the muscle and the tendon okay, as I'm swinging something around like that phone. Okay, I'm going back and forth, or with the cane, going back and forth, and the muscles are being stretched a specific way, the tendons are being stretched a specific way, and the sensors in the muscles and tendons are telling my brain something about the object I'm holding and swinging back and forth. Okay, cool. Let me talk about the research that's been done on this, because you'll be absolutely amazed how much you can feel without touching it in this sense, without our skin touching it. So first, let's go to rods. A lot of this research was done with rods. Boy, this rod's really long. Do I have a shorter rod? No, I don't. Anything nearby? No. Okay, so let's go with this rod. People are given rods of varying lengths. So maybe, maybe in one case, the length is, what is this here? Oh yeah, it's a spring. In one case, the rod's this length. In another case, it's this length. And boy, am I hoping you're seeing me. And their job would be, they'd have their eyes closed. Their job would be to determine roughly how long they thought that rod was just by touching one part and swinging it back and forth like this. Okay. And they're able to do it very well. Let me show you the situation here. So this is what it would look like. So the subject is actually not blindfolded, but they aren't able to see the rod or the hand that they are swinging the rod with. And here what they do, just to make the task easy for them, they're asked to move a wall. I think there's a little electronic device that moves a wall closer to them or further away. It's on a little set of rollers here. It's on a track. And so they just pull the lever back if they want the wall closer or further away, if they pull it forward. And their job is to say, move the wall so it is at a position that you feel like you could just reach with the rod that you can't see. Okay? And it's just a very easy way for them to judge the distance or the length of the rod just by swinging it back and forth. And they can do it very, very, very accurately. Okay? They can tell you almost exactly where that rod is, how long that rod is, okay, by having the wall come close or having it go further away. Say, yep, I think where I've positioned this wall right now is about the length of the rod. Okay, here's your next rod. Okay, they give it to them and say, okay, this one a little shorter, a little longer. Say, yeah, it feels a little long, a little shorter this time. I'm going to move the wall here. And so they'll be able to see how accurate people are just by having them do this. The other thing they'll have them do is judge where on the rod they're gripping. So, since they basically, subjects can't see this, it's on the other side of this barrier here, but they put it on like this. They say, okay, put your fingers down. By doing that, it could be that they're going to give it somewhere in the middle, or they're going to give it somewhere on the end, on either end, something like this, like this, like this, and ask where they are gripping it. And maybe they use the same judgment. They say, okay, how much area is behind your hand and how much area is in front of your hand. And people will do this. They can't see, it's behind a barrier. Say, okay, here's the wall distance that's in front of my hand, and here's the wall distance that's behind my hand. And people are outstanding at that too. Say it's something else. Okay, pretend, can I do this? Yeah, here, it's not bad. Say they're given a rod that's like this, and they're asked to swing it back and forth like this again. They're not seeing it. Say, okay, is there a bend in it? And if there is, what direction is the bend going towards? So I guess it would be a shorter piece that was at the end of the bend, something like this, versus something like this, versus something like this. And people will say, this one does have a bend, and that bend is going to the left relative to my hand. This one does have a bend, and the bend is going straight up this time. And people are really good at that as well. Again, they are never seeing their hand. Their skin is never touching what they are judging. Like, it's never touching. They're never exploring the bend or anything like that. It's just touching one part here, okay? And they are able to tell from how swinging back and forth kind of stretches the muscles, stretches the tendons, something very, very accurate about the thing that they're feeling, basically. And it works really well. This really surprised me. And I actually was was a subject in this experiment. I was a grad student where they were doing this. This is an experiment where it's a much more challenging task than just trying to determine how long a rod is by swinging it back and forth, or even what direction the bend is in by swinging it back and forth. Instead, they ask people to try to guess which shape they're swinging back and forth. And so this is how it worked. They see a whole bunch of shapes. They can see on their vision side of the barrier. So there's a barrier here again, like there was up here. And they're seeing these shapes. They're seeing a cone and a pyramid and a, what is this? I guess a half dome, okay, cylinder, cube. And as you can see, there's handles on the bottom. And the handle is the thing that is put in their hand that they can't see. What they obviously can't see is the shape of the object on the end of the handle that they're swinging back and forth. All they know is that in terms of what their skin is touching, they're just touching this, this kind of very consistent little post again and again. Okay, the post is always feeling the same to them in terms of what their skin is touching. But by swinging it back and forth, they're able, at better than chance levels at least, to determine whether they're swinging the pyramid, as they are here, or the pyramid, or the half dome, or the cylinder, or the cube. Okay, they're able to do this. So they do put the shapes in front of them so they can see, all right? They can make sure that they know the types of shapes they can choose from, but they're not touching this with their skin. They're just swinging these things, and based on the very, very subtle ways that a cone might kind of stretch the tendons and muscles versus the pyramid, as you're swinging it, stretches the tendons and muscles. And you can imagine, I mean, these are the same size, right? They are the same weight. The difference is very subtle between these shapes, but just the way these shapes stretch the muscles and tendons in the wrist as you're swinging it back and forth is enough for the brain to know, oh yeah, okay, I think that one's the cone. I think that one's the pyramid. And people, as I said, they're not perfect, but they're definitely better than chance. And they can do this across sizes, by the way, as well. In other words, they can see objects of one size, but actually be swinging objects of another size. So maybe a mini version of the pyramid, a mini version of the cone and half dome and all that sort of stuff. Again, they're looking at these regular large objects, but they can judge which shaped object they're swinging at the end of the post just by swinging it back and forth. And again, it's the same deal. It's just the manner in which this swinging action stretches the muscles and tendons, which is dependent somehow on the shape of the thing on the other end of what they're holding. Okay, pretty darn cool. What is it? Well, I won't get into the technical details. If you're interested in kinesiology or muscle physiology or something like this, you might want to look into it. It's really fascinating stuff. But it's thought that it's the ways an object resists rotation. I won't get into too many details, but you could imagine that angled object we were talking about before, right? This type of thing. Imagine go back this way. So this is it's just this long on the end. Okay, as I swing this back and forth, the resistance to the rotation at my wrist, okay, will be greater in this direction than it will be at this direction, for example. That's a very, very kind of obvious example. Now imagine it, but so much more sensitive that we're talking about being able to feel the differences in the resistance to rotation of the pyramid versus the cone versus the cylinder. Okay, so it's how the object just resists the rotation that we're doing with our wrists as we're doing this. And our muscles and tendons, little sensors in the muscles and tendons, are telling the brain somehow all this nuanced information about how these very similar objects resist rotation a tiny bit differently. It's very, very cool. It's related to these other experiments that I think are also very interesting. And those experiments have to do with sweet spots. And here I've got this tennis racket, I think I showed you guys before, where people, even who, this does work, of course, with expert tennis players. And these were people who were on the tennis team at the university where this was tested. or novices. They come in and they are asked to judge where the sweet spot is of a racket that they're not seeing. And that's what this is showing here. Actually, this image isn't great. I didn't make it, but it looks like here that they can see the racket. They cannot. It's the exact same situation as you got up here, except here what they're doing. Okay, imagine there's a racket in this guy's hand up here, right like this. And here what they're doing, instead of moving a wall, they're actually moving a little tennis ball on a little pulley system like this. And they say, okay, move the tennis ball to where you think the sweet spot is on the racket. So they don't see the racket. They don't see their hand moving the racket. Okay, they just, okay, so this is behind a barrier. I see the tennis ball there, and I pull the tennis ball. I think the tennis ball would be right here. This is where I'd want to hit the tennis ball for the greatest power in my stroke. And professional, or not professional, college tennis players can do this really well. And novices can do it well too. People who don't even play tennis, who have rarely picked up tennis rackets, they say, you know, if I wanted the most power out of my stroke, I think this is where I would do it. I put the tennis ball right here. This is where I'd want the racket to hit it. And what they're establishing there is the sweet spot of the racket. So yes, you're taking tennis lessons, your teacher will tell you to try to hit the ball at the sweet spot, and they'll tell you how far up the racket it is. And it depends on the shape of the racket, and it depends on how large the racket is and all that sort of stuff, right? You know, when you're starting out, sometimes racket heads are bigger. But you're not only able to do that through looking at the racket. In fact, as it turns out, you're actually a little bit better at it just by the fact that you're holding the racket and going back and forth like this. And this isn't just true of tennis rackets, it's also true of hockey sticks. You ask hockey players to do this, and in this case, they'll move a puck back and forth to where the hockey stick should be, where the sweet spot of the hockey stick, the end of the hockey stick should be, and it's the same thing. Okay, we'll talk more about this next class. We'll talk more about sweet spots and other sorts of tools, and I'll see you in 2 days.